which of these three investors will make the most money? It's not who you think. The one who can time the market perfectly, the one with the worst timing in the world, or the one who just invests consistently. Because it turns out the traditional advice of just waiting for the bottom of the market could cost you $440,000. But to see if that's true, first we need to figure out which of these investors actually made the most money. Then, once we find out why the bottom of the market doesn't always give you the cheapest price, by the end you'll finally know whether waiting for the next crash could cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Now, Andrew, we all want to buy low and sell high. Why is that?
Well, because people think that if you buy something for $100 and then you wait for it to go up to $300 and you sell it, well, you made $200. Then they wait for properties to go down again, they buy it again. But even if you get the timing perfect, you might not get as good a result as you think.
Well, it's so fascinating. I remember I was sitting in my house once when the book Girls That Invest by my friend Sim came out, and I was reading that, and there was this amazing example that she gave in the book where she looked at three different types of investors who were investing in the share market, and it was people who could put in $200 a month for 40 years. And what Sim did was went back and look at the S&P 500. And the first investor had the worst luck in the world. So they'd save up their money. And then when they finally invested, they always bought right at the top of the market. And then they saved their money. And then when they got to the next peak, they bought again. They had the worst timing in the world. The second investor had the best luck in the world. So absolute perfect timing. They saved up their money, $200 a month. Then they always bought right at the bottom of the market, perfect timing every single time. And then investor three had no timing at all, basically me on the dance floor. They just consistently invested $200 a month every single month. Didn't matter whether the market was up, didn't matter whether the market was down. Now, the result is very surprising. I mean, it won't surprise anyone that the person who invested at the top of the market had the worst timing in the world, yet they made the least money. They ended up with about $664,000. Now, the person who had perfect timing and always invested at the bottom of the market, they made more money, $957,000.
Quite significantly more.
Quite a bit more, about $300,000 more, give or take. Now, the thing that's really surprising is that the person who was just consistent, the me on the dance floor, $200 a month, they ended up with the most money, $1.38 million, about $400,000 more than the person who had the perfect timing. And the reason behind this, because I remember sitting there reading that book and being like, this is so interesting. Like, how does this work out? And then I realized it when I went and got a graph of the S&P 500 and looked at it over many years, because it's quite obvious that actually the bottom of the market is not necessarily the cheapest price. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. So there was a bottom of the market in April 2025. So that was what Trump called Liberation Day, where he's going to bring in all of these tariffs. And if you invested at that point, you would have done pretty well, because after that, share prices actually went up quite substantially. However, if you bought at any time before early 2024, say February 2024, you would have got a cheaper price than that bottom of the market. So because asset prices tend to go up over time, even buying at the bottom of the market might be more expensive than if you just purchased a few years earlier, even if that was in a rising market. And I think that because this is so counterintuitive, like, wait, what? Buying at the bottom of the market doesn't make the most money. That's why it is so interesting. And I know you wanted to see if that applied to property too.
Yeah, which is why I like this article I saw on One Roof, and it's written by Ed McKnight.
Oh, what does that guy know?
And this is where Ed actually ran the numbers and looked at property prices over time and compared two investors, Irene, who bought a house consistently every 4 years, and then Mark, who saved up and only bought at the bottom of the market. He was the well-timed investor. Look at that smiley face of yours there. And
I hate that photo. Look how squinty my eyes are. I was staring right into the sun that day.
And after 24 years, both investors, they bought the same number of properties and they spent the same amount of money on properties.
And just before we reveal the results, we see that same pattern that the bottom of the market is not necessarily the cheapest price. So the bottom of the market in Auckland recently was July 2024. That was when prices were their lowest. But if you bought a property at any time before October 2020, that would have given you a cheaper price, right? And so let's say that you were sitting there in December 2012 and you were thinking property prices are going up. This is the boom. I'm not going to buy in the boom. I'm going to wait for the bottom of the market. Well, by the time you got to a substantial downturn in the bottom of the market, 12 years later, property prices were way up than at that time when you were making that decision. And so again, that is just where we've got to remember the bottom of the market is not the cheapest price. And typically, the true bottom of the markets where you can see that property prices or any asset prices have come down, typically those come after a boom. So if you're sitting there in a rising market waiting for the crash, you might have to go through the boom first and then property prices or asset prices settle at a higher level than if you just purchased at that time. It doesn't always work out that way, right? Because if you were sitting at the peak of the market, right, you might think, oh, well, property prices always go up. They don't always go up. That's not the message here. It's just to say that the bottom of the market is not always the cheapest price and that consistent investing over time can actually give a higher return than having the perfect timing all the time. So let's walk through Irene and Mark, what ended up happening in terms of like who made the most money.
Now, Irene, she invested every 4 years, whether it's a good or a bad market in her mind, 2000, 2004, 2008, 2012, 2016, 2020, and 2024. So she just put on a blindfold and she invested. And we assume that her properties followed the market perfectly. Okay. Now, Mark, he only bought at the bottom of the market, the exact bottom of the market. So he had perfect timing. He had a crystal ball. He'd invested the same amount of money. He spent $4.2 million by the time we got to 2025.
So who made more money?
So they both spent that $4.2 million. Irene had made, in terms of capital growth, if they followed the market perfectly, $3.32 million in capital growth. Mark only made $2.9 million. So Irene, even though she didn't have a crystal ball, she had the opposite, a blindfold, she made an extra $440,000.
I mean, does this line up with what you've actually seen in reality?
Well, I mean, I guess I'm a great example. I just invest. I invest whenever the bank will give me money, and I've made good money out of investing in property. Whereas I do have really intelligent and considered investors that do think about whether or not the market's, in the opportune time to buy, and they have made less money. So I guess, in that small sample size, yeah.
And I suppose we often use bottom of the market as a shorthand for the lowest price. And I suppose what we're just showing here is that's not always the truth. Sometimes buying earlier could get you a lower price than buying at the bottom. But why do you think this idea feels so wrong the first time you hear it?
I think because it's so ingrained in us to sell at the top and buy at the bottom. Like, how many times have you heard buy low, sell high? Like, it sounds great in theory, but the way you make money when you invest is just to actually be regular and consistent with your investing, because often people might be limited with when they can actually buy as well. So if you wait for that most opportune time, it might not actually end up working out the way you've expected, like with Mark's situation, but also maybe you can't invest when it comes time to the bottom of the market.
And it was quite funny when I first released this article. I often get the property doomers email me. So people who don't like property at all or don't like investment property. I remember somebody said to me, "You just picked these numbers and picked this sequence to make property look good."
Oh, they thought you'd gone and cherry picked. Like, if you'd gone from 1999 onwards, it might not have been the same result.
Look, if you move the goalposts, I guess, or move the date range, you'll get a slightly different answer. But I'm not the first person to come up with this idea like that. Buying consistently tends to outperform even perfect timing. Because even like I first read about this in Sim's book, but I went back and looked at some of the studies. Like, she didn't come up with that idea either. Like, this has been well documented that typically investing consistently does tend to outperform even perfect timing. And that's what is so counterintuitive and what we're trying to get across. But yeah, if you move the dates slightly, you'd get a slightly different answer. It's not like buying blindly will always outperform, but in a rising market, which we tend to have in terms of all asset prices, right? Not just property, but shares and crypto and gold and all of these things. In a rising market, buying consistently can outperform.
Yeah, but also, like, okay, the alternative is that you have to have that crystal ball to get the perfect timing right. So you can only control one thing, you buying consistently.
So now you know why waiting for the bottom could cost you, but knowing not to wait is just step one. You still actually need the plan. So watch this video next where you'll get my boring blueprint to make 10K a month through property. Click the video on screen and I'll see you in there.